Evening. You don't need to stare at this picture much longer. Let's move on to the agenda for the first session of this course, which I will be covering. I won't read those to you. You can see for yourself that we'll be covering those 5 topics in general. I'm not here to give you a step-by-step how to create a safety plan, but we're going to give you some background that you may or may not already have to help get you on your way to creating a safety plan and really understanding what's required in safety. So let's get on to the next slide, which if we were in person here, I would be able to ask you and get responses from the audience. Who's responsible for construction safety? And what is construction safety? Well, I can't get your answers directly, so I'm going to give you the answers that I think are the correct answers. The answer to who's responsible for construction safety is everybody. I'm going to talk in a minute about what construction safety is. But the point about everybody being responsible for construction safety leads into a really important, maybe trick answer to my question of who's responsible for construction safety. I'm going to say that the person who picked up a camera and took a picture of the man by flammable gas smoking a cigarette, or took a picture of the man using his friend as a sawhorse, that person taking the picture is immediately responsible for putting the camera down and saying, you need to stop this or you're going to cause extreme injury and possibly even death. So the answer is everyone is responsible. Next slide. It is the law, and so there's no getting around this. In 1971, the U.S. Department of Labor was set up with OSHA was established. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration was set up in 1973. California, among 22 other states, got permission to run their own version of OSHA. So Cal OSHA now actually administers its own federal approved federal OSHA under California's Department of Industrial Relations. If you are a web browser, you can go to that Department of Industrial Relations website and find out a great deal of information, and I'll be referring to that as we go. The difference between federal OSHA and Cal OSHA is actually not a lengthy list. There are 3 areas that are more strict in the Cal OSHA plan than in the federal OSHA plan. The one that affects construction most is the permissible exposure limits to various chemicals. And if you are using those chemicals on your site, you need to be very aware of those and include them in your safety plan. The others, process safety, which has to do with refineries and chemical plants, and mining and tunneling, is unlikely to be included in the Peralta set of projects that we do. So it's good to know that they're there, but you probably won't need to pay a great deal of attention to them. Then there are a small number of sections of Cal OSHA that federal OSHA does not cover. Among the ones that relate to buildings, high-rise window cleaning, again, is probably not one you're going to get involved with, but injury and illness prevention plans and ergonomics is a crucial piece of what's required in the employer's plan for both their general employees and especially on a construction site. So you need to pay particular attention to the requirements of the IIPP, as we'll call it. There's a separate section in the Cal OSHA safety requirements about heat illness prevention. That's become a very important thing just in the last few weeks here in California. So be very well aware that there's a section in Cal OSHA for that. And here's one that I think we can be proud that we have taken an advanced approach to what the federal OSHA covered in the area of aerosol transmissible diseases. That is the key point of COVID related safety protections, and that's one that is in the Cal OSHA requirements already. So you need to be paying special attention to that. I think our next presenter will be touching on that a little bit more. Public safety is a big issue, and it's not covered in the Cal OSHA requirements. There will be Cal OSHA requirements, but there will also be some requirements in the program management plan that is just being finished up now for public safety, because these are occupied campuses, they're operating campuses, and doing construction around operating campuses, especially students, community college students who are focused on a lot of things, but probably not on the safety related to the work that you're doing. So you need to be very well aware of that. All right, we're ready for the next slide. Here's a list, and I'm certain that you will be given the opportunity to download this presentation so that you'll be able to read this list for yourself. I certainly don't want to do that. There are far too many responsibilities to cover, but generally speaking, the employer has the responsibility to provide a workplace that's free from recognized hazards that could injure or cause death to their employees. But it goes farther than that. It goes to the public as well, as I just mentioned. These, again, I don't think there's anything in particular here that pops out at me immediately. Among the most important things is anything that happens, immediately report. Any kind of a serious illness or injury, and certainly death of an employee that might or might not be related to directly to the construction, but we need that kind of reporting to be carried out rigorously and immediately when those things occur. So those are the employer responsibilities, but as you see at the bottom of the list, it's much, much more than this. All right, we're ready for the next slide. So you will have to, for your company, for your employees, set up a safety plan. The safety plan will include, but not necessarily be limited to these elements. An emergency action plan is almost the most immediate thing that you need to have front and center for your employees, and you need to be training your employees and on safety weekly and having safety talks, because in fact nothing is more important than safety. The hazard assessment, we'll talk a bit more about the types of hazards and how to do hazard assessment in the next portion of this presentation. There may be situations, these are for the most part older buildings that will be modernized. There may be situations that have asbestos, so there needs to be an asbestos control plan. You can read all of these for yourself. I don't need to read them for you, but your safety plan is going to be quite a vigorous plan, and it is specified as part of what you need to provide to meet the Cal OSHA requirements. All right, next slide. In terms of your attitudes towards safety, it's no coincidence that safety is the first presentation in this series of the Build Peralta Academy, in that there truly is nothing more important than safety. If any of you have had the very, very unfortunate situation of being of having an employee or even yourself being injured on a job, or heaven forbid, a death on a project, you know that this is a devastating thing for the the team, for the person's family, of course, but it also has an effect on the overall program. And so there truly is nothing more important than dealing with safety on a daily, minute-by-minute basis. So the most effective way of treating hazard risks, number one, is to eliminate or substitute the situation. So this will, as you do a hazard assessment, the first thing that you want to consider is whether you can eliminate or substitute something in a way that makes that far more effective than anything else that you can do. The next is to apply engineering controls in advance, and these are going to include things like barricades and guards, limit guards for power equipment and so forth that are in place before anyone even starts to do work. Safety devices, guards and interlocks. The previous slide talked about lockout procedures. If you happen to be an electrical contractor, you are very familiar with not doing work on any electrical systems without having very specific lockout procedures to keep anybody from coming along and accidentally re-energizing a system and causing a hazard. Warning systems, these are barricades and tapes. As I said, in the case of college students, they are sort of renowned for not paying too much attention to warnings, and so you have to be particularly vigilant around occupied campuses. Administrative controls deal with training and work methods. These become less effective than the four previous systems, and the last and important but not as effective are the personal protective equipment, and all of that needs to be a part of your safety plan. All right, next. These are just a few of the hazards that you can anticipate. There are far more than that, and the list on the right is an important one for you to pay particular attention to if any of these apply to your work that you may be doing. The OSHA standard is listed along with how many violations were faced. Again, this is for the federal OSHA list, but it will be the same kind of list as you'll see in California as well. So fall protection, hazard communication, scaffolding, lockout and tag out, respiratory protection. Here's a big one in the age of COVID. Ladders, powered industrial equipment, training requirements for fall protection, machine guarding, and the PPEs and life-saving equipment. Okay, I'm rushing through this, and I expect that there may be some questions that come up, and we'll try to deal with those. So we're ready for the next slide. So in the end, safety is all about paying attention to the details. The people that you see in these pictures, this might look even slightly amusing, that there's a man in a trench and he's having a load of gravel loaded on him. There's a man with a circular saw whose cord is running through a puddle, and it looks like that cord has been repaired a bit. That might seem a little bit amusing, but there certainly is nothing at all funny about somebody getting buried in gravel or somebody being electrocuted. And so paying attention to the details that the person with the saw and the person in the trench might not have noticed. If you see it, say something. If you smell it, hear it, or feel it, you have to say something. It's very crucial that everybody feels that responsibility. And as employers, you're responsible for training your employees so that they understand the importance of safety in every single detail. So I think that's the last slide that is mine. and it should come next to questions and answers. Let's see what we've got in any questions. I'm not able to.
Mark,
Yep, I'm here.
there are no questions that have been asked by the participants. They are enamored with you, so they haven't asked any questions. So you've covered everything where there's no questions to ask. So right now, no questions have come in. Oh, Ed Dillard had his hand up. Ed, you want to put your question in the chat?
I can't access the chat.
Yeah, but it's not that he didn't put his question in the chat. So there's no questions at this time.
Okay, I think
So
you'll
maybe
notice.
there's questions at the end of Bill's presentation.
Okay. Let me then move on to introduce Bill Kane to do our next section.
Oh, sorry. One question just came in, Mark.
Too late. Okay.
So
Now, what is the question?
do primes require a safety plan for their subs? I guess, do primes require a safety plan for their subcontractors?
That is up to the prime, but it honestly is it's a question that doesn't matter, because as an employer, you are required by Cal OSHA to have your own plan. So whether or not the contractor does, and they should, require it of subcontractors, and your plan needs to reside at the construction site as well as in your office. And it needs to be specific to that construction site. So yes, in a roundabout way, you are required, though not directly by the prime, but by Cal OSHA itself. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Are we ready for Bill?
Yes, we are.
Bill Kane is the Director of Safety for Avitus Group. He's a safety professional with over 16 years of occupational experience in general and construction industries. He served in the United States Army and Army Reserves for 24 years and is currently a brigade level operations sergeant major at Fort Harrison in Montana. His military occupation specialties include construction engineer, infantryman, ammunition specialist, and wheeled vehicle mechanic. Bill's passion for safety spurred from a workplace injury that he sustained while only 17 years old. You see, it can happen to everyone, especially younger people. Has developed into a career that he takes extreme pride in. Bill is the creator of Defend Yourself safety concept that educates business about risk, accountability, and leadership. Bill Kane, you're up.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. I loved your presentation as well. Good evening to everybody. I'd like to, first of all, thank you for being here this fine evening, and I'd like to thank Build Peralta Academy for giving me the opportunity and asking me to present for you today. Our roadmap for this second session of this course, I'm going to try to take you on a journey, because I believe that safety is an integral part of all business operations, especially in the construction industry. It is associated with understanding the need for safe work environments, and we must contrast that with assigning responsibility for ensuring that safe work environment. So we'll begin this journey by discussing what the components of risk are, and then dig into job hazard analysis. Next, we'll talk about injuries and worker compensation claims, and how to leverage safety to reduce loss. It's important to gain a broader understanding of controlling loss, because as it's been shown that highly successful construction projects have demonstrated early and active involvement from the owners drastically affect the safety and quality performance of contractors on the job site. So we're talking about subs, primes, we're talking about everybody on that job site being affected by owner involvement early and constant. The flip side of the coin, however, when owners fail to provide direction with safety, can result in catastrophic results. At the end of this session, we're going to use the COVID-19 pandemic to demonstrate how to implement that safety philosophy, safety goals, and to effect delegation of competent persons to achieve state and federal compliance, as well as achieving your organizational success. Next slide, please. The Defend Yourself Safety concept. This is a concept I came up with. It's really a mindset that the individual worker, the team, and the organization must embody. It all stems from a morning when, just after a tragic family accident, I was kissing my wife goodbye for a week of travel, and she said, "Be safe." She said the two words, "Be safe." And we've all heard these words time and time again. At the time that I heard those, they didn't strike me as anything different. They didn't strike me as anything special at the point of, go and do something different today, even from the perspective of a safety professional. The words "be safe" are really a innocuous statement. We say these words to each other all the time, but what does it really mean? So I'm going to ask everybody for just a moment I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, but I want you to open them back up so that we can continue this on. But close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you're blindfolded and you've been led into a room by someone that's close to you. Let's say they leave and they shut the door behind them, but before they close the door, they say those two words, "Be safe." What feeling does that evoke inside of you? What are your thoughts about that? Now consider the same situation, and this time when they leave, they say the two words, "Defend yourself." The feeling that we get when someone says "be safe" is lost in the minutia of what we do every single day. We fail to recognize hazards around us, and therefore we become exposed to potentially deadly hazards. Yet when we take on the "defend yourself" mindset, we become prepared, we become ready to avoid injuries, and we become prepared to survive. Next slide, please. So some expectations from my presentation. I want to leave you with a new philosophy, a new owner safety philosophy, and it really surrounds that "defend yourself" mindset. I'm going to introduce you to some new safety goals, and I want to define for you the role of the competent person. Next slide, please. So getting into this, we said we'd talk about hazard assessments first. Hazard assessments really play an important role in everything that we do in high hazard industries such as construction. Some major root causes of workplace injuries, illnesses, and incidents include failure to identify those existing hazards, failure to conduct assessments of existing hazards, and failure by competent persons to control and mitigate those hazards. So I consider 4 components of risk when I discuss basic risk management. And those 4 components are before you. They are risk understanding, risk acceptance, risk mitigation, and risk adaptability. So risk understanding. We must have a good understanding of what the tasks are that we need to accomplish in order to achieve organizational success. What are the steps associated with those tasks, and what are the risks associated with it? We need to know what types of resources are going to be needed, what type of time, what type of property, and how many people that we have potentially exposed to these potential risks. The next step is risk acceptance. Risk acceptance is a really important facet that I think is missed a lot of times when it comes to risk management, and missed a lot of times when it comes to safety. The biggest question that we want to answer when it comes to risk acceptance is, what is acceptable loss? What is our acceptable loss as the business owner? And once I understand what that acceptable loss is, then I can start to put in place efforts to reduce the understood risk to a level of acceptable loss. So what are those limitations? Do we have insurance limitations? Are there deductible limitations? And once we understand what that acceptable loss is, we need to communicate it, okay? Think about it as we understand that the acceptable loss is that there's potential for equipment failure. This task that we're about ready to perform, there is a potential for additional time to be lost. Or it could even be to the extent of there's potential for a life to be lost. Now, if you think about that, if you communicate that message to the people who are at hand, and you say there's potential for a life to be lost at this task, do you think that people will be more adept at identifying the hazards that are around them and performing at a high level? Or do you think that they'll go into it with blinders on and not see those hazards that are around them? So communication is very important here. The next step to risk management, and the third component of risk, is risk mitigation. There's a difference between mitigation and abatement. First of all, mitigation is taking a risk and lowering the potential or the severity of it to a level that could be potentially acceptable. Abatement means that we're going to completely remove that risk from the equation. Next, we want to analyze our measures. What are our systems to measure the actual risk and the controls that we are going to use to mitigate them? Lastly, as far as risk mitigation goes, we have to have a plan for supervising the safety protocols and refining as the process goes. And that really leads us into the fourth component of risk, which is known as risk adaptation or risk adaptability. So when it comes time to performing a task, we plan, we prepare, we execute. When we start to execute a task, as soon as the first nail is fired from that pneumatic, as soon as we break ground on the foundation, we all know that all good plans go out the window, because execution, there's variables that come into play that change how we've planned it out. What we need to do is we need to have high quality, empowered individuals that take disciplined initiative when it comes to decision making. All right, risk adaptation says that we put together a solid plan for equipping our team with resources, making sure that we've identified and controlled all of the known and suspected hazards, but we still accept the fact that we can't predict the future. And when we empower our individuals and understand risk adaptability is key to the tasks at hand, we now can start making sure that our employees are aware of their surroundings and take action upon those hazards that they're presented with. Next slide, please. Job hazard analysis. So our competent person should be performing some sort of a job hazard analysis every day on every task at every job site. Here's a 5-step process for performing a job hazard analysis. It begins with identifying hazards, assessing those hazards, developing controls, implementing controls, and supervising and refining those processes. So the first step, identifying hazards, we need to know what tasks and subtasks are part of the operation and what risks are associated with them. Next, the assessment. We need to identify the level of risk associated with each task. Identifying the level of risk that's associated with each task is a simple comparison. It's a comparison of the probability of the potential for the exposure and the severity of the exposure. And when we compare the two of those, if we have a high potential and we have a high severity, that means that we have a high level of risk that's associated with that task. That means that we need to put a major focus on that task to ensure that we lower the level or potential of injury. Next thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be developing those controls to mitigate the hazards. We use the hierarchy of controls that we learned from Mark earlier, and we utilize those to eliminate or substitute that task out. to engineer a safer way to conduct that operation, or we limit our access or provide training to exposures. And finally, we will protect our individuals by putting on suits of armor or personal protective equipment. Okay. Again, personal protective equipment is the least favorable, and it is the last on the hierarchy of controls. Big thing here is when we develop and when we've developed that control, we want to communicate it, and we want to document. What did we put in place? What are we passing on to the subordinate workers to ensure that they are protecting themselves and giving them as far as resources? When we implement those controls into the operation, it's very important. Last thing is implementation. So this is happening during the execution of tasks, and it's important to monitor for our performance. Okay, so we want to make sure that we've communicated those. We want to provide supervision, and we want to empower our individuals through that time. Lastly is the ongoing process, and the most important process here is refining what we've put in place. Once we've put a plan in place, it does not mean that it's over. We have to keep on looking at it. We have to keep looking at weaknesses and vulnerabilities so that we can overcome them and make them strengths so that the team can actually accomplish organizational success and go home at the end of the day. Next slide, please. So who is responsible for these JHAs? Who's responsible for understanding risk and applying these things? Yes, everybody in the organization, like Mark stated, is responsible. And we talk about that as from the safety perspective. But competent persons are a key to your organization's success. And the definition of a competent person, is an individual that is capable of identifying existing and predictable hazards in the workplace. And they have the authority to take prompt corrective action to eliminate and prevent them. Okay, so it's two parts. One, they have the ability to identify. Okay, once they have the ability to identify, somebody has to have given them the authority to take prompt corrective action. Who gives that authority? That comes from you. If you're the owner of a business, if you're the supervisor, if you're the general, you are the one who gives them that authority. Now, there are other ways to achieve a status or a certification as a competent person. And you can see on the right-hand side there are some Cal OSHA requirements for competent person. Some examples, obviously, are excavation, fall protection, lift slab concrete, wood framing, and steel erection. But just about everything that we do in the construction world and in the any other world can and should necessitate assigning and delegating an individual as a competent person. And that is because somebody has to have the authority to take action when a hazard is known to be there or we can predict a potential injury from occurring. Okay. Next slide, please. So understanding claims and injury management is really all about making safety pay for you, all right? Injury reporting regulations and guidelines by federal OSHA mandate specific requirements for reporting and recording fatalities, catastrophes, that was a hard word to say. And that requires us to submit certified documents. So how do we make it stay? Well, we create an understanding for that potential loss, okay? First of all, we have what are called our EMRs, mod factors, mods, X mods, all these are the same thing, but an EMR is our experience modification factor. This is a rating based on our past injuries and our loss statistics, and it's compared to the industry potential for exposure and hazards. So if I'm in a high hazard industry and I've had a history of injuries, my EMR rating is going to be rather high. If I'm in a high hazard industry and I've had 0 injuries at all, well, my mod factor is going to reflect on the industry that I'm operating in. These ratings have a direct impact on how much you're going to have to pay for your workers' compensation premiums. It's very important that you pay attention to these, because you having injuries is going to cost you a lot more in the long run. And in the safety world, we talk about the iceberg effect. What do we see on the top? Well, we see obviously that the employee was injured and we had to pay for those costs. But underneath the surface, there is a whole lot of additional costs associated to injuries occurring on the job site. Next, we'll talk about reportable and recordable injuries. I want to point out that the Cal OSHA website, www.dir.ca.gov.etools, has a great guide called the Brief Guide for Reporting Requirements. And it really covers all the ins and outs of how to properly record injuries. So Cal OSHA does have the 300 and the 301 forms. These forms are senior executive certified documents that are used to record on the job injuries. The 300 Alpha or the 300A is required to be posted in the workplace from February 1st to April 30th. And it's used to record injuries that result from beyond first aid level treatment, injuries that require days away from work, injuries that create restricted work, injuries that result in loss of consciousness, death, and hospitalization. Now, reportable injuries, these are everything from a near miss to a loss of life. So a reportable injury, based on standard operating procedures, could be a near miss and somebody didn't even get hurt, okay? But we want to utilize our own processes of reporting those injuries internally and externally by the use of a first report of injury, by use of incident reports, and using the DWC-1. Some timelines. Employers must remember they must immediately report any deaths or serious injuries and illnesses by phone within 24 hours of the knowledge of the hospitalization or loss. You can, however, report via email. However, in my experience, it's a little bit more difficult because it raises some questions when the report writer is not fully descriptive and doesn't know all of the information that's required for that report. Again, I ask that you refer to the Cal OSHA website. You can type in a search for report a work-related incident, and it'll take you to an actual site where you can put in the city that the incident occurred in, and you can actually get detailed information on where and how to report that. But when it comes time to reporting, you want to know who, what, when, and where. You want to have the time, date, and location of the incident, the employer information, who is reporting, provide that information, who's the point of contact on the scene, or who's the point of contact for the organization, what are the natures of the injuries, where the treatment is being provided, and a fully in-depth description of the accident. Lastly, making safety pay for us. What do we do when it comes to treatment and refusals to treat? First of all, every business owner in the state of California should be familiar with their medical provider networks. You need to know where you're operating and who is in your area to be able to get your employees to receive the appropriate care. One of the best ways to do that is by the use of a nurse triage program, nurse triage / self-care programs. They take a injured employee and they manage the injury as a case rather than as a claim. So you get to put the injured employee in contact with a licensed professional healthcare provider, and they try to manage that injury with self-care and first aid. In the event that it can't be managed as self-care or first aid, then they advise you on your medical provider network, get you to the emergency, the in-person provider to provide that information for you. And the last thing here is documentation of refusals to treat. So we've all had situations where we've sprained our ankle, we've stubbed our toes, nothing, we didn't think anything big of it, and we said, oh, I'm gonna shrug this one off. If you or your competent persons or your supervisors have a employee who decides to shrug it off, you need to document, okay? Document the refusal to treat. I've seen it a number of times, especially with back injuries, where, I felt a tweak in my back, but it's just a normal thing. We need to document that it's a refusal to treat because it's going to save you money in the long run. Next slide, please. So one way to contain injury costs is to develop and implement the modified duty or early return to work program. This program is an effort to minimize the length and costs of temporary total disability associated with work-related injuries, and it allows an employer to offer injured employees work within a medically directed, limited physical profile. So why do we want to have an early return to work program? First of all, we get the employee back to work. Okay, getting the employee back to work reduces lost time, and it helps to improve the morale of the team. And believe it or not, it's been statistically proven to assist that injured worker in improved recovery time. So how do we develop this early return to work program? First of all, it starts with planning and preparing alternate job needs. Okay, those alternate job needs, those alternate jobs do not need to be equivalent in compensation. When it comes time for planning and preparing those alternate jobs, the biggest thing here is to seek guidance from human resource specialists and to observe the advice given to you or the restrictions provided to you by the medical provider. Next slide, please. So we're going to get ready to talk. I'm missing some on that slide there. Maybe one more. There we go. Okay. Go ahead and build this slide all the way out if you would, please. Perfect. That's it. We're going to get ready to talk about COVID-19, and this is really just applying what we have talked about to something that is current that we could potentially all be dealing with or all dealing with now. And I want to start off by saying that everybody should reference the CDC's and OSHA's COVID-19 sites on a regular basis to make sure that you're staying up to date with exposure control plans according to the new information that's being processed, because it's coming out on a daily basis. Also, you need to know what your state, your local city governments have as far as regulations pertaining to this topic. The next thing I want to say is that as a business owner, supervisor, you need to make sure that you familiarize your team with those state and federal regulations as well. You need to be familiar as much as possible with what's going on, and remember that your employees know more than you know about this situation. It's important to educate yourself. If somebody knows more, go learn more about it yourself, all right? So we want to identify the engineering and administrative controls that are appropriate. So we really want to think, hey, are vaccines in place? Can we eliminate this problem? What can we do about it? The next thing we want to be looking at is sanitation. Sanitation is great. We've known about hand washing for many, many years, okay? But we want to make sure that we're monitoring and documenting this process. Monitor and document the standards for it and ensure that people are following it. Again, this is a competent person task. This is something that we want to make sure that we have a competent person, somebody with the authority to act upon it, to enact this. So the last thing we want to talk about here is what to do when an employee exposure occurs. The HEROES Act, the Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solution Act, is soon to be promulgated by OSHA standards. Okay, so promulgated by OSHA standards, we're talking about in the next 2 years, 24 months, there will be a federal OSHA standard on aerosol infectious materials. Based on the enactment of this or approval of this act, within 7 days, they have to put something in place. We need to know how to report, and we need to know what those standards are. Next slide, please. So if an exposure or a suspected exposure occurs, let's plan for that employee exposure and in place measures to prevent it. We already know that COVID-19 exists. We know it's a known and predictable hazard, so we need to start with the planning and preparation and start doing our hazard assessments now. Communicate your stay-at-home orders with your employees, okay? If you have stay-at-home orders, employees want to earn money and they'll come in to be on the clock. So set up your temperature checks before you get to the time clock. You want to get eyes on those employees. Require return to work notices for anybody who has potentially been exposed. Return to work notices need to come from licensed professional healthcare providers. And then last thing, require a 14-day no contact incubation period for any sort of return to work. Next slide, please. So developing an action plan, again, just like building a safety plan, we want to build it in writing, all right? So everyone should be conducting that hazard assessment and know where their exposures are. Second thing, we need to develop those controls and know what we're doing to limit and mitigate and abate those risks. Third thing is implement that plan, conduct training, and communicate. This creates a mutual trust amongst the organization. Finally, review, supervise, and refine. Next slide, please. Get it in writing. Again, create that written plan requires putting together a policy and implementing it into a handbook. Remember that an SOP is simply the how to do of that actual plan. Be ready with administrative documentation, and again, use your return to work to folks that potentially are injured to help out with this, but ready your documentation. Use your team to ready those documents that you need for rehires, updating documents for I-9s, planning for employee turnover. Be prepared for it. Be realistic about it. Don't pretend like it's not going to happen. Prepare for it to happen so that you're ready to survive the next day. And again, stay informed. CDC.gov is the best resource for this COVID-19. Get your labor posters up in Spanish and English. Make sure that they're at all job sites and all work site locations, and inquire with your general contractors and other subs that you work with that you understand the best practices that work alongside everybody else. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Next slide. Okay, so the hazard assessment, all right, how do we get the most out of that hazard assessment? Ultimately, it includes that initial site survey. It requires us to look where and how the employees could potentially be exposed, to control the risk, and to document the potential for occurrence, document, and communicate. A hazard assessment form is simply a means of communication. And that's really the best thing that you can describe it as. We're writing down a plan to communicate how to control these hazards. We're explaining to you the accepted loss that we are willing to take, and we want you to be aware of the potential for injury. Next slide. So job tasks with varying exposures. You see at the very top of my pyramid there, we have very high risk. These are those folks that are nurses and healthcare providers. They're in close proximity with potential exposures on a daily basis. I would say that in our industry, we're going to find ourselves in the high to medium exposure risk, where we have deliveries coming and going. We have exposure to new crews and various practices, and we have frequent contact with others in close proximity. The low risk exposure are going to be our employees that are in isolation or working from home, have very limited contact with others. Next slide, please. Our controls, obviously, we're gonna start off here just looking at engineering controls, and you see the gentleman there getting his temperature checked. Engineering control is a temperature check. We're gonna do this before we actually have our employees making contact with others. Also barriers and positioning such as the 6 foot social distancing guidelines that we're all familiar with. When it comes to administrative, we wanna look at those daily screening protocols, limiting exposure protocols, and implementing sanitation methods. And then lastly, personal protective equipment. Understand that employers are mandated to provide personal protective equipment if you require your employees to wear it. Have a system in place for enforcing it. Inspect what you expect. and that's what you'll get out of it. If you want your employees to wear it, then you wear it and make sure that they understand that that's important to you. It's important to you, it'll become important to them. Next slide, please. So I hope that the Defend Yourself safety concept has helped to apply some of the philosophy needed to create a positive safety culture and a successful organization. It's able to think and communicate the high costs of injuries on the job site. And again, communication. Please know that working in high hazard environments, you should be prepared to support the safety program. You should be prepared. Your supervisors should be prepared so that you don't have to pay the high cost of loss. So during this presentation, we discussed a brief introduction to risk management, hazard assessments, understanding of claims, implementing an early return to work program, and the importance of empowering workers with competent person designation.